Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping right into some seriously incredible ancient texts to explore a super universal human experience. We're talking about those moments when we face absolute rock-bottom frailty and somehow find unexpected power. If you've ever wondered exactly how these scriptural narratives frame the collision of human weakness and divine strength, well, you're in the right place. We're going to break down how this dynamic actually works straight from the source material. So let's get into it. Okay, let's kick things off with this core thesis from Psalm 84. This is basically the foundation for our whole exploration today. Notice how the text here doesn't describe strength as some static, unmoving state. No, it's a progression, from strength to strength. It tells us that within this ancient framework, hitting divine power isn't just a one-and-done event. It's an ongoing journey. You're moving from a place of total depletion into a renewed state of power, which ultimately culminates in a divine presence. And we're going to see exactly how this plays out in the historical narratives.
But, before you map out the methodology, we really have to sit with the reality of the people in these texts. These stories absolutely do not shy away from human suffering. So we have to ask a pretty heavy, deeply empathetic question. How does someone find strength when literally everything is lost? Sure, it's easy to talk about going from strength to strength in theory, but the source material anchors this right in the middle of visceral, agonizing human realities. To get the text answer, we have to look at folks who had absolutely nothing left in the tank.
Which brings us to our first major case study, Hagar's desert experience.
To really grasp this, we need to slow down for a second and trace what is essentially a 14-year emotional and physical roller coaster. Hagar's story in Genesis unfolds in 5 distinct phases. First, she's pregnant and on the run. Second, years later, she faces a final devastating expulsion. Third, we see her wandering in the desert. Fourth, she receives some incredibly unexpected comfort. And finally, she's granted lasting protection. By tracking these 5 steps, it's like a blueprint. We can clearly see the architecture of how the text portrays this massive shift from total despair to divine strength.
So, phase 1 starts with a desperate escape. Back in Genesis 16, Hagar is pregnant and she just flees from her mistress Sarai, heading deep into the unforgiving wilderness. She is completely alone, totally vulnerable. But then, the text notes this sudden divine intervention. An angel of the Lord finds her by a spring and essentially tells her to turn around, go back, and submit to Sarai. She's basically given a directive to walk right back into a tremendously difficult situation, which, as we'll see, sets the stage for a much longer narrative of endurance.
Then we fast forward 14 years, and man, things reach a total breaking point. After a major family conflict where her son Ishmael is caught mocking Sarah's son Isaac, the narrative in Genesis 21 takes a truly heartbreaking turn. Abraham officially expels Hagar and her teenage son. He just sends them packing into the harsh wilderness with nothing but some bread and a skin of water. That's it. She's completely cut off from the household. Her entire sense of security is just stripped away in an instant. And this plunges us into the third and undoubtedly most agonizing phase, utter desert despair. Wandering out there in the unforgiving desert of Beersheba, the inevitable happens, right? The water runs out. The text paints this incredibly bleak picture here. Fully believing her son is about to die of thirst, and just unable to bear the agony of watching it happen, Hagar puts him under a bush, walks a good distance away, completely collapses, and just weeps aloud. I mean, it is the absolute ultimate picture of human limitation and utter hopelessness.
But right at this precise moment of absolute despair, everything changes. The narrative just shifts gears completely. God hears the boy crying. And notice this. Divine intervention doesn't show up instantly with physical tools, but first with profound comfort and a massive, massive promise. God calls to Hagar from heaven, tells her not to be afraid, and promises to make her son into a great nation. Think about that for a second. The sheer scale of this promise completely rewrites the reality for a mother who, just seconds ago, thought her entire lineage was ending right there in the sand.
So the crucial takeaway here is how this divine intervention actually plays out in her physical reality. The text tells us that God opens her eyes, and suddenly right there she sees a well of water. She fills up her water skin, gives her son a drink, and gets this immediate physical salvation. But the story doesn't stop there. The source text makes a point to note that God was with the boy as he grew up in the wilderness, eventually becoming a skilled archer. So Hagar literally moved from weeping under a bush, waiting for the end, to finding long-term sustainable security.
Now let's pivot for a second and look at Section 2, situational strength, specifically with Samson and Peter.
While Hagar had to endure this grueling 14-year journey, the source material also gives us these wild, intense bursts of situational strength. The contrast here is actually fascinating. Take a look at Samson in the book of Judges. The Spirit of the Lord hits him, and he suddenly gets the unimaginable physical power to tear a lion apart with his bare hands, which, let's be real, is definitely not your average Tuesday. But then, contrast that with Peter in the Gospel of Matthew. He's stuck in the middle of a terrifying storm out on the water, and his situational strength looks totally different. It manifests as this sudden burst of divine courage to physically step out of a boat. So you have raw physical power on one hand and deep psychological courage on the other, both provided exactly when the crisis hit.
So that naturally leads us to our third section, the actual ways to attain this divine strength.
We've seen the historical case studies now: Hagar, Samson, Peter. But what does the source text say about the actual methodology? Like, how do you actually get this strength? Psalm 33 sets up a really stark contrast for us here. On the left side, we have failing human methods. The text is super explicit. A king isn't saved by the size of his army, a warrior doesn't escape by his own sheer strength, and relying on a war horse for victory? Total vain hope. Basically, conventional military might and human effort just aren't gonna cut it. But on the flip side, we have God's provision. The text claims the eyes of the Lord are on those who fear him, actively delivering their souls from death and keeping them alive even in a famine. The source is clearly framing reliance on the divine as the only true, fail-safe security.
And if we look at the final verses of that exact same psalm, accessing that security requires a very specific mindset. It requires patience. And this is key, we're not talking about just twiddling your thumbs and passively waiting. This is an active, expectant trust. The text literally says, "Our soul waits for the Lord. He is our help and our shield." This kind of scriptural patience means actively trusting God to act as a protective barrier against harm. And amazingly, doing that allows the heart to actually rejoice, even before the tough circumstances have changed one bit.
And honestly, nothing illustrates the ultimate reward of that act of patience better than some of the most famous imagery in the entire source material. Over in Isaiah chapter 40, it says that those who wait on the Lord will renew their strength. They'll mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. It's such a powerful metaphor. The text is promising a complete transformation of your capacity. Just like an eagle catches a thermal updraft to just soar without constantly flapping its wings and exhausting itself, the promise here is that those who actively wait on divine strength are going to be carried right through their exhaustion. So as we wrap up this explainer, we've got to ask how these ancient frameworks apply to us right now. We've seen Hagar weeping in the wilderness, Samson taking on a lion, and those beautiful poetic promises of soaring like an eagle. These texts really challenge us to examine our own vulnerabilities. So I want to leave you with this one provocative question to chew on. What is the desert situation in your life right now that requires you to stop relying on those failing human methods, start actively waiting, and ultimately prepare to soar? Thanks so much for diving into these fascinating texts with us today, and we'll catch you next time.